send out later. I'll go ahead and start back from the beginning now that you all can hear me. My name is Keith White, meteorologist and climate services program manager for the National Weather Service, serving Austin and San Antonio and 33 counties throughout South Central Texas. We'll start by looking back at last winter. December of 2021 was the warmest on record for the entire state of Texas, and you can see temperature anomalies were about 10 degrees above normal across much of South Central Texas, even as many as 12 degrees above normal in some portions of our region. There was quite a bit of a cool down then into the beginning of 2022, but we did see, despite cooler than normal temperatures in both January and February, the overall wintertime temperatures were above normal, thanks in large part to just how warm December was last winter. We did have one winter weather event last year, and that came overnight into the morning hours of February 2nd into the 3rd. There was quite a bit of surprising heavy rainfall ahead of the advance of freezing temperatures. And then after the freezing line moved through the hill country and the I-35 corridor, many locations saw accumulations of ice and sleet, as high as about a quarter inch of ice in portions of the region, and a few reports of sleet as much as 3/4 of an inch accumulation in a few areas in the hill country. Looking at last winter as a whole, we did have, like I said, the warmest December on record, which helped us see for 3 of our 4 long-term climate sites relatively warm winter temperatures. In fact, it was the all-time warmest winter in Del Rio, thanks in part to the drought conditions that were in place there in 2021. It was also very dry, especially over the west half of our area, but even in the areas that were somewhat wet, almost everywhere in South Central Texas last winter had below normal precipitation. And those deficits carried over through the rest of this year, as we'll talk about here in just a moment. First, let's look back just over the last 30 days. And we did see throughout the course of the middle of November a few pretty decent rainfall events, but not everybody, unfortunately, got it nearly as much as they were hoping for. Some locations, more than 5 inches in northern Burnett County and in eastern Williamson County, and then areas with 3 or more inches across much of the coastal plains and the northern I-35 corridor. But out west, some locations getting less than an inch and even less than a half an inch south of Eagle Pass. And so translating that to percent of normal over that 30-day period, we do see some areas clearly saw above normal rainfall in these greens and blues, but many areas, especially here in Bandera, northern Medina, southern Kerr County, less than 3/4 of their usual rainfall over that period. And that's on top of longer-term deficits. So over the last 3 months, many locations stretching from the hill country through San Antonio and down, into the Winter Garden region, less than half of their usual rainfall through the fall. And then over the last 180 days, you can start to see some of those August and early September rains appearing here over the Rio Grande Plains and much of Valverde County. However, as many of you are keenly aware, it's been very dry around San Antonio, New Braunfels, and portions of the hill country to the north of there over the last 6 months. Looking at things just a little bit differently, this is a departure from normal precipitation graph year to date. And over the course of this year, any of these areas that are depicted here in red are seeing deficits of over a foot of rainfall this year. And some of these darker reds, more than 16, even more than 20 inches less than normal in some locations. And considering that yearly normal rainfall is in that 30 to 33 inch range, many of these areas have only seen about 10 to 12 inches of rain this year. At San Antonio International, that's just over 11 inches. We've now, broken out of that driest year of all time, but it would take about 2.5 more inches by the end of the year at San Antonio International to fall out of second place for driest yearly rainfall, nearly 20 inches below normal there. We'll switch gears just a little bit here and talk about winter climatology. My apologies that I don't have the other long-term climate sites on this slide. I thought I had added them back in, but it's pretty similar data. At many of our locations outside the hill country, it's about once every 4 years on average that we see measurable snow. So that's any snowfall over 1/10 of an inch. And about double that, once every 8 years for any snowfall greater than 1 inch. Obviously, we all remember back in 2011, San Antonio had 3 different snowfall events that tallied up to 6.4 inches in total. That really was their second snowiest, tied for their second snowiest season of all time. And then before that, it was all the way back to just over 5 years ago on December 7th of 2017, when we had that sort of surprise snowfall event that brought almost 2 inches to San Antonio. These stats are pretty similar across the area. The hill country does see more frequent wintry weather, not just with snow, but also with freezing rain and with sleet. And then areas down to our south in the coastal plains and the southern Rio Grande plains, do typically see even less frequent wintry weather. Looking back just since 2007 at our winter weather advisories, winter storm warnings, we average about 2 a year of those nuisance type winter events, minor accumulations, typically impacting mostly bridges and overpasses and other things that freeze more quickly. We have issued 7 winter storm warnings for Bexar County specifically since 2007, so about once every 2 years. But there were, of course, 2 of those in 2021, with just how busy that week in mid-February was for our area. Our winter climatology for temperatures and precipitation is here on the right. Temperatures, daytime highs, daily average, and then overnight low temperatures throughout the course of the year. So we sort of bottom out right at the end of December with average daily high temperatures for most of our area in the low to mid 60s, and then average lows down in the low 40s for most locations. We're in sort of a drier season for most of our areas, especially out along the Rio Grande near Del Rio. Even in an average year, they only see about 3/4 of an inch of precipitation per month out west. A little bit more on the order of 2 to 2.5 inches, highest over our eastern counties from Austin eastward towards the US 77 corridor. And really the driest month of most locations is February, looking at our 30-year averages. In terms of severe weather here on the left, we don't typically see a lot in the wintertime. There are a few reports here and there. Typically, more often those are hail reports for our area, especially once we start getting into late February and transition into our much busier primary severe weather season in the spring. But flooding is also relatively uncommon in the winter as well. Can't be completely ruled out. It has occurred from time to time. Usually it's pretty minor, kind of like what we saw on the evening of February 2nd earlier this year. Let's talk a little bit about our frost and freeze program. Here, this map shows our average first date of freezing temperatures. You can see, obviously, areas in the hill country usually see their first freeze pretty early in the season, and that was the case this year. A lot of locations in the hill country have already had their first freeze. Due in part to the urban heat island effect, the cities of Austin and San Antonio don't typically see their first freeze until early December. We're already past that. We'll see some cooler weather coming in about a week's time. Unclear whether we'd get our first freeze just yet. But many of you will remember with just how warm December was last year, we did not see our first freezes in Austin and San Antonio until January. Now, despite that, they still had their most days, mornings fall below freezing since 2013, 2014. But that's just one example of, some of the different types of wintertime variability that we can see here in our region. So this map shows just the counties which have been discontinued from our freeze warning program this year. Given the frequency that our area sees freezes, we only really issue one freeze warning per year for our counties. However, in the Austin and San Antonio areas and much of the rest of South Central Texas, yet to see its first freeze. So when we do sort of see the whites of its eyes, so to speak, those areas will see a freeze warning at some point this winter. All right, so let's start talking a little bit about the future. As many of you are aware who've been on these talks frequently, our wintertime weather is pretty heavily impacted by the state of ENSO being the El Nino Southern Oscillation. And that is driven largely by sea surface temperatures in the Pacific Ocean. And so this map here in the bottom left shows the blues are cooler than normal waters as of the 7th of December. And those are driven by easterly winds across much of that ocean. And those temperatures have a significant impact on the storm track across North America, especially in the late fall, winter, and early spring months. We'll see La Nina continue through the winter, but the latest outlook does call for a likely return to neutral conditions by late winter or early spring. And then just as a long lead heads up, there are starting to be some hints of favored conditions towards El Nino for next fall and winter. That will be something worth watching, as it could bring us back into a regime of wetter than normal conditions at some point, either late this year, late 2023 or early 2024. So this map kind of shows the average conditions in El Nino on the left, and then La Nina on the right, and typically drier and warmer than normal on average for our region here in Texas. Those are just our average conditions, and doesn't necessarily pan out every year, but most of the time. And I'll show you the breakdown of those odds here in just a moment. We'll look just at this area here boxed in red. A tool I use called the Local Climate Analysis tool can look at these CPC forecast regions, and we'll look just at this one, but know that the data for the other two regions that cover South Central Texas look very similar to this. Looking just at the left sides of both of these two graphs, this one for temperature, this one for precipitation, we're looking at during La Nina, odds tilted very heavily towards above normal temperatures in that region 64, and slightly less heavily, but still, certainly a statistically significant result. About 50% of La Nina years in that region do wind up drier than normal for the December, January, and February period. In terms of snowfall events for South Central Texas, looking overall, on average, La Ninas tend to be a little bit less snowy. El Ninos, a little more snowy. For us, obviously, that doesn't necessarily mean snow in any year, regardless of the state of ENSO. But it's also worth noting that, despite the fact that snow is slightly more likely in El Nino, significant snow events are actually typically tied to La Nina in our region. And that includes the big winter of 2021 in February. It also includes the San Antonio snow of record back in the 84-85 winter, when over a foot of snow fell in San Antonio. Again, not every La Nina year is going to feature significant winter weather, but it does maybe tilt those odds a little more in favor of that potential. And then lastly, in terms of severe weather, winter is clearly not really a busy, severe season to begin with. And La Nina does, kind of continue to tilt those odds a little bit lower for really all forms of severe weather, although the signal is a little bit weaker in terms of wind damage events for our region. But again, 3 or 4 reports in a big 33-county area over the winter isn't really a whole lot, especially when you compare it with our very busy spring season. So here's a look at the latest outlooks from the Climate Prediction Center. It does look like we'll finally see a pattern change out of this very warm and humid weather sometime around the morning of the 14th. We'll see the first cold front move through. And for the period of the 16th through the 22nd, odds are starting to lean towards maybe some cooler and wetter than normal weather through that period, and potentially beyond as well, although confidence is not very high for the Christmas time week, obviously this far out. These outlooks from the end of November for the month of December, showed some odd leaning towards above normal temperatures, but kind of pulled back on the precipitation outlook a little bit. A very slight lean towards below normal for the parts of the hill country, southern Edwards Plateau, and then equal chances of above, near, or below normal precipitation, for the rest of our area. It's been pretty dry for many locations, mostly just some, drizzle in the mornings, not a whole lot of accumulating rainfall. We'll see what some systems can bring us next week, but obviously it would take a lot to make up for the long-term deficits that I talked about earlier. For the season, looking out through the end of February, still continuing that sort of canonical La Nina looking pattern for equal chances to our north, and then looking at sort of a likelihood of warmer than normal conditions overall. And again, remember that doesn't mean that it's always going to be warmer than normal. Some of our winters feature some pretty roller coastery weather where you get a few days above, a few days below. Winter is our higher variability season in South Central Texas. Just as an example, the last few days have averaged out to about 20 degrees above normal, but those really cold days in February 2021 were 30 to even 35 degrees below normal. We certainly don't see that kind of variability in our weather in the summertime in South Central Texas. But when you average out the 3 months, like we've seen the last couple of winters, definitely leaning towards warmer than normal conditions. And even higher confidence, you could even say likely below normal precipitation is the current expectation for the winter months for much of our area. In terms of drought, we've clearly got a significant portion of the central parts of South Central Texas under significant drought. Extreme, even exceptional drought remains. Much of this is now shifting more towards long-term impacts. Our soil moistures, at least at shallow depths, have begun to improve. However, looking at deeper soil moisture and at other things, there are some longer-term impacts that continue to rear their heads. And the outlook is for areas that are not currently in drought over the coastal plains to potentially see drought return throughout the course of this winter, if indeed these warmer and drier than normal conditions continue. Now, one caveat is that it does look like we're expecting a pretty quick return to ENSO neutral late in the winter, and there's not a whole lot of good analogs for that. Usually there's a relatively gradual decline in the sea surface temperature indices in the Pacific. So there could be a few wrenches thrown at us as we head through the late winter into the early spring. But time will give us a better idea of what to expect there. So here's just a few of the drought impacts that we've seen. Even with the wetter than normal conditions we saw in mid-November, many of our basins here in South Central Texas continue to see below normal stream flows. This is a 14-day average stream flow graphic from the USGS. A little bit better condition across sort of Cibolo Creek and portions of the San Antonio River Basin, and then up into the Colorado River Basin as well. But up here at the top, you can see the historical data from Medina Lake, clearly about as low as it gets. It hasn't been this low since the 2013 to 2015 period. Before that, basin started to recover from the drought that began in 2011. And then looking at the longer-term data from the wells in the Edwards Aquifer, we've also seen very little improvement over the last month, and really the lowest values there since 2015 as well. What that might mean for fire weather? Well, in the short term, given the wetter and cooler weather in November, the energy release components across much of our region are below normal, but you can see the green line is forecast to trend upward over the course of the next couple of weeks. And then the National Interagency Coordination Center outlooks that are issued out 4 months do also show an expectation for above normal significant wildland fire potential once we get into February across portions of Texas. So I'll wrap things up here. Given how dry it's been and the expectation for continued dryness and that it's a climatologically dry season, no real expectations for significant flooding concerns. Obviously can't rule out a few minor flood events, and all it really takes is one. So it's always a good idea to be prepared for any possibility. However, not a high likelihood for any flooding concerns. Fire weather below normal for now, but we could see that trend upwards late this winter and into the spring. And the same goes for severe weather. Obviously, we'll be looking at entering our primary severe weather season by the end of winter and into March. And then, for winter weather, the same deal. It does look like, the expectation is probably below normal potential for winter weather. However, with that knowledge that significant winter events can and do happen here. And so pay close attention to our forecasts and outlooks throughout the course of the winter. So the takeaways, I'll reiterate, obviously, this winter is expected to continue to remain warmer and drier than normal on average. However, that doesn't mean we won't see some winter weather from time to time. We should be prepared for that possibility. And based on historical recurrence, obviously, it's very unlikely we'd see anything similar to what occurred back in February 2021. The chances of that happening in any given year are less than 3%. And so with that, thank you so much for bearing with me as I dealt with some technical issues today. I am going to re-record this and get a recording and the slides out to everybody by Monday at the latest. But for now, if you're all still there, I will do my best to answer any